Good evening and welcome. Thanks for coming. Started the recording. I'm going to leave everybody unmuted in case you want to say something. As I mentioned last week, you are more than welcome to ask questions or comments during the presentation. Just keep them to the point. If it's a tangential point, what we'll do is we'll address that in the schmooze portion of the presentation. So, as is usual, our format, I'll make a presentation on the rich material we have on this topic of meditation, Judaism, and self-mastery. And we'll finish with a brief meditation so you have an idea of what this is that we're talking about. And then we'll have a schmooze, which is a time to ask general questions and make general comments about the topic and other points we hit. I encourage everybody to bring a friend. This is generating a lot of interest. Working on a website, as a matter of fact. We have the Facebook group for additional material. So I'm going full speed ahead and making as many resources available as possible. So to begin, let us share the screen. Okay. Sandy, can you see this? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so questions. Fortunately, people have been asking questions and making comments. They text me, email, that's all good. I'm going to address all the questions in time. Here's two from last week. If standing is better than sitting in meditation, why are we sitting at the end of each session instead of standing? Okay, I'm going to address that. The answer is simple. It's because sitting is simpler. We're doing a very simple, basic meditation, the point of which is to develop the skill of focusing your mind and being able to assert some control over your thoughts. That's easier to do sitting than standing because you can get more comfortable when you're sitting than standing. Believe it or not, it's harder to remain comfortable when you're standing. It takes some training. It takes training to get the proper alignment, proper posture, proper chest position so that you're comfortable. If you are already at that point where you are comfortable standing, then stand. But for most people who are just learning this basic technique, it's easier to sit because you have less of your body to worry about. You only have one half of your body to worry about. When you're standing, you have both halves. So that's why. Second comment was, I am not getting anywhere in my meditation. There is no special feeling. And Steve, what has been your highest experience? I'm going to have a class on this topic next week. We're going to take a break from the presentation of Rabbi Kaplan's comments and teachings about meditation, and in particular the Amidah, which is where we are now. We're going to talk about the mechanics of meditation, what benefit it is, where you should do it, when you should do it, to give people a taste of the practical. I'm still going to be top heavy on the background material because when we plunge back into our lives, we need to have a good historical perspective and we need to have certain teachings to make our practice of Judaism more spiritual. So that's why we have a content-rich class. At the same time, more and more I'm seeing that people have a need for some assistance on implementing this in their life, even in a rudimentary way. So allocate time, maybe on a quasi-regular basis, to address that. It's going to be interesting. Some of Rabbi Kaplan's teachings we will be able to incorporate, and I'll bring in some other material well. And since people are asking, I'll talk about my personal experience. Okay, so we have an answer to this one, and we get some answers to this one next week. We're going to continue now with what Rabbi Kaplan calls the rules of praying the Amidah. And one of the rules is facing Jerusalem, as he says. If we're here, we're facing east. Even if you're in the eastern part of Israel, if you're east of Jerusalem, you then turn and face west to face Jerusalem. Okay, and we're going into the why. So let's start. Okay. So, delving into my library here. This is what he says about Jerusalem. Whenever possible, one should face Jerusalem when reciting the Amidah. If one is in Jerusalem, one should face the site of the temple. The physical location of the temple is a source of spiritual energy, and facing in this direction helps draw this energy from the site of the Holy of Holies. According to ancient tradition, this was the place that Jacob called the gate of heaven. And we looked at the pasuk in Breshit, and as such, it is the primary source of spiritual energy. Again, according to Rabbi Kaplan's worldview, to his hashkafa, there's a system of energy on this planet, in this universe, and there's a flow, and there are prime points where the energy can be accessed. I'm going to make it a side remark that reinforces this point. In the story in the Torah about the creation of the world, there's a commentary by Nachmanides, the Ramban, that goes as follows. He mentions that King Solomon knew of meridians on this planet where there was different energy flows, and different energy flows were more beneficial to growing different types of vegetation. So he knew, in what is now Israel, he knew where the best meridian was to plant leeks. And it's because he knew that there was a central point outside of the land of Israel that was a good source of energy for that meridian, and that energy happened to be beneficial for growing that type of vegetation. So that's an example about how in Jewish thinking, there's an understanding of energy flows where there's key points, and if you can access them through a kind of meridian. And he's basically saying that Jerusalem and the temple and the Holy of Holies and the ark, and in particular, as we said last week, the point between the cherubim, the cherubs, is a prime point, an access point. If you're familiar with yoga and stuff, it's kind of similar to me as what we call a chakra, and what acupuncturists and acupressure specialists use. So it's the same kind of idea as I understand it. Okay. Now let's learn a little bit more about what he says in terms of in Jerusalem from another one of his books, Prayer and Prophecy. Let's see. Okay. Okay. Now, we talked about the meridians. We talked about he's giving a number of reasons as why Jerusalem is a focal point in our prayer. And when we say prayers referencing Jerusalem, what that can symbolize in our minds. Another significance of Jerusalem is that prayer, it's a focal point of prayer and prophecy. And this is what he says. Here we begin to see a close parallel between prayer and prophecy. Just as the space between the cherubim was the focus from which prophecy emanated, so it was the focus to which prayer was directed. To some degree, this can be understood in light of what Rabbi Jacob Ben Asher writes in his tour, which we'll get into, that prayer itself is meant to be a highly mystical experience where one can attain a level close to that of prophecy. When a person stands in prayer, his mind ascends to the spiritual realm, and he can completely divorce himself from the physical. According to Rabbeinu Yonah, the Gerundi, this is the meaning of the teaching: in prayer, one's eyes should be cast downward while his heart is directed on high. Okay. Okay. What is that about? He's making some very advanced concepts here. He's saying that prayer can be like prophecy. He's saying that the focal points in Jerusalem and the temple and the Holy of Holies and the Ark between the cherubim are not just focal points for prophecy, but they're focal points for prayer. And if we have this in mind, then our prayer can be similar to prophecy, where it's kind of a transcendent experience. Now, obviously, that's not the mindset that most people have when they walk into shul, when they daven at home, but this is the direction we want to take it. Okay, so let's break it down a little bit. Who is Rabbi Jacob Ben Asher, and what is his tour? This is just referenced by Rabbi Kaplan. So from the Chabad website, we can understand this. Rabbi Jacob Ben Asher, his nickname was the Tour, and he's in the 1200s to the early 1300s. They speak very highly of him. He was a compiler of halacha of Jewish law, and his work, which we'll get into a little bit, is the basis for the Shulchan Aruch, which is a standard code of law used today. Okay. The name Tur, which means row, is the name of his major work, and as is very common among scholars, he was given the nickname, that is the name of his major work. Okay. Learned from his father, used the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, put together codes, and unlike the Rambam, who got into Ashkafa, who got into perspective, got into philosophy, the Torah just kind of boiled things down into daily life. Paid attention to those concepts that pertain specifically to what we do. And he broke it down into 4 parts. He called the Arbatorum, the 4 rows. And the first one was called Orach Çhaim, the way of life, which deals with daily living, specifically prayers and Sabbath and festivals and prayers. Okay. So the Shulchan Aruch was then compiled, interestingly, combining the work of 2 scholars who had not met each other. Rabbi Yosef Karo, living in the mystical city of Svat, and Rabbi Moshe Isserles in Poland, working at the same time on similar projects to compile Jewish law. Okay, and the work of the Torah fueled their work. So what's interesting here is that you have a scholar of the Torah taking highly spiritual ideas in terms of transcending normal, regular, mundane experience, in terms of trying to elevate your experience of life, trying to show how that relates to daily living, in particular prayer, and doing such an outstanding job that later compilers of Jewish law used his work as the basis for their work. So that's a testimony to not only the spiritual worldview of the Torah, but his ability to communicate his ideas in such a way that they were put into play for your average Jew. Okay, and one of the sections, one of the 4 sections of the Torah was called the Orachaim, and this is the one that deals with prayer. And what does it say about prayer? in looking at this, we'll see just how spiritual was his approach to prayer. This is what he says. One who prays needs to intend in their heart the meaning of the words which are coming out of their mouth. They should think as if the divine presence is before them and remove all distracting thoughts from themselves until their thoughts and intention are pure in the prayer. Obviously, even from the little bit of instruction we've had about meditation, we could see he's emphasizing the need to have the skills that we're trying to develop, be able to control your thoughts so that if you're here standing before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, standing before God, you're not thinking about what you're going to have for lunch in an hour. All the time, we're going to find that people who act as our spiritual advisors are going to emphasize the need to control your thoughts and be focused in the here and now and what you're supposed to be doing. And that's why we said in the very first class that those advanced meditators, Rabbi Kaplan, people in martial arts, people in Eastern religions, are all saying meditation is controlling the content of your mind. And then you build on top of that, but this is the basic skill. Okay. And one should think, to go on, if they had to compose one's words before a king of flesh and blood, how they would prepare the words and say them with great intention, which we would call kavana. You got to mean it. All the more so before the King of Kings, the Holy One of Blessing, he who sees all thoughts. And so did the pious ones and the mystics who secluded themselves and concentrated on their prayers until they achieved the falling away of their corporality and the enhancement of the strength of their consciousness. Okay, what he's describing here is interesting for two reasons. One is very obviously it's an advanced state of mind. You and I can't go to shul tomorrow or daven at home tomorrow and expect to transcend our body when we're davening. However, people have done that. And those people that have done that are telling us that it's possible. And interestingly, he's saying it's possible during prayer, meaning you don't have to go and live in a cave for 15 years and achieve these kinds of things. They're basically telling us, those people that have achieved a certain amount of spiritual enlightenment, they're telling us it is possible when we go daven mincha tomorrow. So that's very encouraging, and it's a testimonial to the level of spiritual quality of life that we once had. Okay. Then he goes on to say, prayer is in place of sacrifices, the korbanot, and therefore one must be careful to follow the format of sacrifices with respect to intention and not let other thoughts mix in, similar to unrelated thoughts which would nullify sacrifices. We're not going to get into sacrifices per se, but this is an example about how prayer parallels sacrifices, because what was in your mind when you made a sacrifice and offer a sacrifice at the time of the temple was crucial as to whether that sacrifice was acceptable and legitimate. Similarly with prayer. And prayer must be recited standing like the service in the temple, in a fixed place like the sacrifices. So he's moving on to mention how the intent, the mindset, and the arrangement of the prayer service has to be meticulous and meaningful, as were the sacrifices. Okay, so we could see why Rabbi Kaplan, in this teaching about prayer and prophecy, referenced Rabbi Jacob Ben Asher, the Torah, because he put together a very spiritual perspective on prayer, and emphasizing that we can have quite the spiritual experience when praying, an experience that comes pretty close to the experience, the spiritual experience that people that have prophecy have. Okay. 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 Speaking of sacrifice, Rabbi Kaplan then makes this point regarding, again, why we focus in our minds on Jerusalem. Another reason we pray toward Jerusalem involves the close relationship between prayer and sacrifice. The prophet alluded to this relationship when he said, "We shall make up for our bullocks with the offering of our lips." That's from Hosea, which we'll get into in a minute. It is thus established that the daily prayer services were ordained to take the place of the regular daily services. Sacrifices, even today, in many ways, the laws involving prayer are derived from its relationship to the sacrifice, including the rule that it must be recited standing and the feet together, and one's head covered, just like a priest offering a sacrifice. Okay. Okay. How interesting. So then he goes on. In light of a number of concepts already discussed, says Rabbi Kaplan, it is easy to understand the relationship between prayer and sacrifice. The slaughtering and burning of the animal sacrifice symbolized the subjugation and destruction of the animal and man. When the animal was burned on the altar, it returned to its elements and ascended on high. When a person brought a sacrifice, he was able to meditate on this, nullifying his animal self and liberating his spirit so that it could commune with God. The soul then returned to its own element, which is the spiritual. Therefore, the bringing of a sacrifice was a highly mystical experience. The Hebrew word for sacrifice, korban, comes from the root karab, meaning close, since it brought man close to God. The concept of prayer is very similar to this. When a person stands before God, he becomes a total spiritual being, totally divorced from his animal self. The only difference is that instead of experiencing this through sacrifice, the individual does so through uttering words of prayer. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about these details, because now what he's saying is when we're praying and we're mindful of the need to think of Jerusalem and to face Jerusalem, and we're thinking about the importance of prayer, we're thinking about how close prayer is to prophecy, and we're thinking about how close prayer is to the sacrifices we made. These are things that we're thinking about, and the more that we understand these, the richer our experience of prayer is going to be. So with all this information, the more we understand how special prayer is from a spiritual point of view and how close it is to sacrifice, the more special our experience of prayer will be. Okay, so what does Chabad say that reinforces what Rabbi Kaplan said? Chabad says the sacrificial service was not primarily about the physical act of slaughtering an animal. It was principally a spiritual service. On a basic level, if the sacrifice was being brought to atone for some inadvertent sin, one had to feel remorse over what happened. To assist in reaching true repentance, he would bear in mind that what was done to the animal essentially should have occurred to him. This needs obviously some more study because the animal is being killed. So I'm quite sure that Chabad here does not mean that the death penalty is for everything. So that would have to be worked out. But nonetheless, they're stressing you need the animal should be kind of a shaliach, somebody that you send forth that represents you. And metaphorically is and the act of slaughtering that animal or having the animal slaughtered for you is in some way a cleansing process for you. That, to me, seems to be a pretty sophisticated point of view, which would require a lot of study and repetition for somebody to really have that mindset when that actually takes place. Another way of understanding sacrifice is that the animal one brings as an offering to God is symbolic of our own inner animal, our instincts and primal desires that we must bring into alignment with God's will. we surrender that part of us to God and make it submissive to him so that it too may seek to do his will, meaning the animal part. Now, this is kind of interesting because there's definitely a perspective on sacrifices that I know the Rambam talks about a lot, which says that Torah living and Torah practices are a weaning away from pagan, idolatrous practices, and that if when God gave us the Torah, he would have said, okay, all that stuff you're used to with the animal sacrifices for phony idols and all the bloodlust and all this other stuff you guys are used to, stop today, because tomorrow it all becomes spiritual, against human nature. So there is a weaning process in which we still engage in animal sacrifices, but instead of trying to appease fertility gods, instead of it becoming a bloodless kind of thing where people are just letting their base energies out, we have a higher purpose here. We're focusing it towards the one God and trying to do some internal work on ourselves in doing so. So we were doing the same thing for a higher reason. So that's where I think this is coming from. And then, of course, from the perspective of Kabbalah, the sacrifices were a way of elevating the matter and vitality of this world to a higher plane, in addition to elevating the various layers of the human soul. Sacrifices in the temple also elevated the actual animal being offered, thereby elevating the entire animal kingdom. Okay, that's exactly what Rabbi Kaplan says. Chabad and Rabbi Kaplan are saying the same thing. I don't know much about that. However, there's going to be, at some point, a session we have on metaphysics and the soul. There's a really great biblical scholar named Ethan Dorshav that has a very good understanding of metaphysical philosophy that we can find in Tanakh and what Tanakh says about souls. And it's going to relate a little bit to this, but stay tuned for that. Okay. Now, as is our habit, when Rabbi Kaplan quotes a verse in Tanakh, we're going to try to get an understanding of why he chose that verse. He chooses verses, he's not the only one choosing verses like this. There's other scholars who would refer to the same verse and for the same reason in the same context, and we'll try to see why they're doing that. So again, what he referred to was Hosea. We will make up for our bullocks with the offering of our lips. He's talking about, Hosea is talking about using verbal avoda, verbal service, as opposed to physical sacrificial service. Why? There's a few ideas here. First of all, he lived almost 3,000 years ago, 8th century before the Common Era. Minor Prophets. We actually read this verse, which is from chapter 14 that Rabbi Kaplan just quoted. We read this in Shabbos Shuvah, the Sabbath between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The Talmud claims he was the greatest prophet of his generation. He was a prophet for 60 years. And he, early prophet, and at least according to, this is Wiki, he was the only prophet of Israel at the time who left any written prophecy. I think that's pretty true. Okay. Now, why did he at this time, 800 years before the Common Era, start talking about prayer as related to sacrifice? So this is what Chabad has to say about that. They're talking about Shabbat Shuvah, okay, and we read from Hosea, okay, talking about Teshuvah. The first reading is from the book we're discussing. He lived at the time when the state of Israel, comprising the 10 northern tribes, began to succumb to the mighty Assyrian Empire. He warns and pleads with the remaining tribes of Judah and Benjamin to mend their ways and return to God, lest they experience a downfall similar to that of their brethren in Israel. So already the majority of the Jewish people had been assimilated into the growing Assyrian Empire. And this prophet's basically making a plea to the remaining tribes saying, don't make the same mistake. And he's looking at the mistakes made by the 10 tribes and basically saying, we got to learn from them and prevent what would happen to them to happen to us. Okay. And the oft-repeated style of the prophets, Hosea tells the people that God is not interested here in donations and sacrifices. Take words with yourselves, he instructs them. Approaching God in such a way will guarantee atonement for even the harshest of sins. What might have been thought to be the function of bullocks, meaning sacrifices, should be replaced with lips, direct and sincere communication with God. Okay. So we can ask a question here. What was the problem of giving the sacrifices, and what did it have to do with the 10 tribes getting off the path and assimilating themselves into the growing Syrian Empire? What is the big deal about how is he saying that sacrifices became corrupted? And is he saying that we were sinning in doing the sacrifices? That's my question. He obviously had a need to emphasize that we should replace the sacrifices. Now, one might say, well, here's one problem. The growing Assyrian Empire was a threat, and as we know, several hundred years down the road from when Hosea was making this prophecy is when we lost the temple. So maybe he saw the handwriting on the wall. Maybe he's thinking, okay, we need to prepare for a time when we're not going to be able to make those sacrifices, because we need the temple to make those sacrifices. And if we're invaded, or worse, if people voluntarily assimilate to this growing foreign empire, and the empire says, sorry, no more sacrifices for you, and we willingly do that, what's going to happen to our so-called spiritual life? So maybe he's preparing with great foresight his people to avoid that problem, and to basically say, okay, if we start having a spiritual life unrelated to sacrifices now, then should the time come when we're not able to make sacrifices, we'll be ready, and we won't have lost our spirituality completely. We'll have prepared. Maybe. Okay. To find out a more specific answer, I looked at Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who, if you haven't come across his writings on the Nevi'im, they are so special. And this is a person who gets it. And this is what he says about this prophet and this pasuk. Okay. Okay. This is the book. Volume 1. I actually just ordered volume 2. Okay, this is what he says. He has a big concept, Da'at Elokim, which we would, if I was to ask you what is Da'at Elokim, you'd probably say knowledge of God. Okay. He has a slight twist on this idea. He says the words Da'at Elokim means sympathy for God, attachment of the whole person, his love as well as his knowledge, an act of involvement, attachment, or commitment to God. So when he says knowing, it's kind of like the modern Israeli way of knowing. You can know somebody physically and as well as mentally. So he's taking that whole body-mind concept, saying, when we say Da'at Elokim, we need to invest all of ourselves in knowing God. He says the biblical man knew of no bifurcation of mind and heart, thought and emotion. He says that in biblical times, we didn't have the separation of body and mind. When the concept of self was whole. Okay. Okay. So he says the word da'at, then as we have seen, has an intellectual as well as an emotional meaning. In most passages, the intellectual component of da'at is stressed. In Hosea, the emotional seems to be primary. His da'at Elohim does not connote a knowledge about God, but an awareness of God, a sensitivity for what concerns him, God, a concern for the divine person, not only for the divine will, a concern that involves inwardness, as well as action. And this is something that Heschel says all the time. Remarkably, he talks about how the Nevi'im identified with God. And because when they, and he says that when they speak in the first person, I, God, am saying this, which Nevi'im do, it's not like they're just a mouth and God is speaking through them like a microphone. He's saying, no, they're identifying with what they think God is experiencing, even though God is not corporal and stuff. They're having this empathic relationship with God, so to speak. And that's what he's stressing is da'at. Okay. And he says that knowing about, we're not just knowing about God, we're having an awareness of him. Okay. It's an emotional identification with God. Okay. And the loss of da'at is the cause of man's undoing. Okay. So he compares him to Amos. He says, Amos, the prophet Amos, the principal sin is injustice. To Hosea, it is idolatry. Amos inveighs against evil deeds. Hosea attacks the absence of inwardness. Okay. So what he considers to be idolatry is a complete identification with the external, so that it's all physical and there's no internal component. So when he says that we have to communicate with God with our lips, he's stressing we have to start engaging, we have to start having an inner experience of what we are doing. So what he's talking about is, in his mind, at the time we were doing sacrifices 8 centuries before the Common Era, when the Assyrian Empire was growing, he's saying it's not so much that we might lose the ability to sacrifice in a couple of 100 years if we get conquered by Assyria and we don't have the temple or it's destroyed or we can't use it. He's saying we've already dropped the ball. We've already had this. We already lack inwardness. Maybe we talk about God, but we don't have a sense of God. Okay. So we need to develop what he's calling this inwardness, this sense, this link to God. Okay. Now, interestingly, if I was to ask you, what is the Hebrew word for prayer, you'd say tefillah. And what we call tefillah directly relates to what this prophet means when he says inwardness. This is from the Chabad website. In Hebrew, the word for tefillah, the word for prayer is tefillah. What does the word tefillah mean? There are 2 translations that are literal and accurate. The word tefillah comes from the word palel, which means to judge. Tefillah is a time of self-evaluation, self-judgment, introspection, when a person takes the time to focus on himself and goes within himself to see what it is he needs and so on. Okay. And on another level, in another translation, tefillah means attachment. When we daven, we create a bond between ourselves and our Creator. Prayer is a process of putting things together. When we daven, there are only 2 things in the universe, God and ourselves. This is the connection. So isn't it so interesting that what we've come to know as prayer, tefillah, is exactly what Hosea was talking about. When he's talking about the lips, when we're praying and we're vocalizing what the prayers are, we're supposed to be looking within and see what does that mean to us. When I talk about the gathering of the exiles, or when we talk about healing, when I talk about all this stuff, what does that mean to me? So Hosea was onto something when he started talking about using the lips, that very well could be the starting point of us changing our orientation to the avoda, to the service, to looking within. And that is what prayer has had to become, a process of looking within and a process of connecting to God. And that's exactly, according to Heschel, what Hosea was talking about. So I think that when Rabbi Kaplan is talking about prayer and sacrifices, this is the connection. He's banking on Hosea, saying Hosea is guiding us to make the transition. So what that means for us when we daven tomorrow, wherever we're going to daven, is we're going to make sure that we're looking within and we're trying to make it a connective experience, and work on, what does that mean to us, and try to make that work for us. Okay. Let me just take a quick look. The last thing that Rabbi Kaplan talks about in terms of the significance of Jerusalem is that it's the place of the Sanhedrin. The final reason we pray towards Jerusalem is that it was the place of the Sanhedrin, and as such, it was the chief location of schools where the Torah was taught. Thus, when we focus our prayers towards Jerusalem, we are also combining them with the merit of the Torah, through which they became more acceptable before God. As mentioned earlier, even when worship services were held in the temple itself, they were held in the hall of the Sanhedrin. Okay. So we need to know just a little bit about the importance of the Sanhedrin. If Rabbi Kaplan is saying we've got to be focused on Jerusalem, and one of the reasons is because Jerusalem was where the Sanhedrin met, this Sanhedrin must have been a pretty important institution for us to try to connect to it in our prayers. Okay, why? Okay. Okay. Let's just go to, all right, the origin of the Sanhedrin can be found in the Council of 70 Elders founded by Moshe Rabbeinu, by Moses. So these are, when Moshe was commanded to get himself a board of directors, get some assistance in understanding and transmitting Torah. And according to this point of view, that was the first Sanhedrin, 71 people. That's the beginning. And as is described in Pirkei Avot, there actually was a smicha, there actually was a physical person-to-person transmission of authority from Moshe to the elders, to the prophets, to the Knesset Hagdalah and the Great Assembly. Okay, moving on and on and on. Real smicha, real ordination, I appoint you type things. Okay. And the Sanhedrin are the people that actually formed the institutions that were invested with propagating our spirituality. They compiled the laws, which became the Mishnah. They compiled the prayers, which we say, including the Amidah, which we discussed, blessings before and after food, and on and on. And they basically gave us the Tanakh, 24 books of the Tanakh, including the 5 books of Moses. Okay. They met in the chamber of hewn stones in the Temple of Jerusalem. They didn't meet at night. They didn't meet on the Sabbath or the festival. The head of the Sanhedrin was a Nasi. Okay. And very importantly, who were these guys? As Chabad tells us, every judge, every person that served in the Sanhedrin was required to have the following 7 attributes: wisdom, humility, awe of heaven, a loathing for money, even his own, a love for truth, the love of the people at large, and a good reputation. Okay, Torah knowledge, what we would consider to be secular knowledge, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, calendar, astrology, knowing about idolatry so they could adjudicate cases involving it. Okay, so one reason why we are remembering Jerusalem and as the place of the Sanhedrin is that we are realizing that we among us had people of the highest Amidah, of the highest personal characteristics. People who have a character comprised of these traits are pretty mensch-like, are people whose judgment you would want to follow. So in one way, recalling the Sanhedrin are recalling that there are people who have been among us and who I'm sure still are, who have these qualities. And it's important for them, it's important for us to have these people of these qualities. Okay. Okay, and then he talks about, Rabbi Kaplan talks about Jerusalem being the gate of heaven, which we discussed. There's some kind of metaphysical architecture, which maybe we'll touch on as we go, that has to do with once we leave the physical realm, where our prayers go and so on. That's how he summarizes it, which we only have a very slight understanding of what he's talking about. It hopefully we'll be able to build on that as we go. Okay, so that is why we face Jerusalem when we pray according to Rabbi Kaplan. And before we meditate, I just want to stress that I don't expect anybody, including myself, to have all this in mind when the next time we daven. However, the more we go over this material and the more we understand this material and we understand its significance, the richer our experience will get. We'll keep chipping away, chipping away, chipping away, chipping away. And then tomorrow's davening will become more meaningful, and next month will be even more meaningful. I mean, that's what, this is a road, you know, so nobody's going to find their prayer experience 100% turned around by tomorrow, but we stay on this path with everything he is teaching and everybody else that we're going to be looking at. Our spiritual experience is sure to get better. So I'm going to continue next week with the how to pray discussion, starting with bowing. Now we're going to meditate. So again, the whole point here is to get a taste of what we're talking about. Let me just stop this for a second. So hold on. Okay. I'm going to stop the recording.